Hi everybody, it's Elliott here. I hope you're doing well. I'm just out and about in Whitechapel today, and behind me is the location of where Jack the Ripper committed his first murder. Now, Jack the Ripper is an infamous serial killer in England who committed a series of murders of young women. Nobody really knows why he did commit those murders. But yeah, I'm just at the location where that first murder did take place of Mary Ann Nichols. And this was way back in 1888 in Whitechapel in London, obviously where I am now. So it's way back in 1888, about 125 years ago. And you can see behind me how it looks now, but it would have looked a lot different back in 1888. You know, the streets would have been very dark, they would have been very dingy, very mysterious, you know, very dirty as well. Very low income, really tough place to live. There was lots of poverty, there was lots of crime, prostitution, and everybody was just trying to make their own way, but it was very hard to get by and not a lot of food. And it was also a big transition for England at that time, right? There was an influx of Jewish immigrants, Irish immigrants, European immigrants, and these people came to London and they was all trying to live together in very sort of cramped and crowded and dingy conditions. And there would have been some definite conflict there, conflicts of interest there, but the unconditional other acceptance of other people was probably non-existent at that time. Probably wasn't even a thing back then. And yeah, Jack the Ripper, nobody really knows why, but he committed a series of murders, like I said, of 5 young women at least. There may have been 2 or 3 more, but there's no conclusive evidence that they were linked to Jack the Ripper. And you know, you might be wondering why I came here today for OCD recovery, and you think, Elliot, what are you talking about? Well, this ties in with Harm OCD, right? And the fact that, you know, when we do have Harm OCD, we can have that propensity to want to avoid things to do with harm. So we might avoid watching documentaries, we might avoid articles, we might avoid going to tours of, you know, Jack the Ripper tours or certain tours of old crimes. So yeah, like I said, it's very important to go towards them and to try and really expose yourself to that whilst working on the belief systems about causing harm. And of course, you know, these acts that Jack the Ripper committed were very heinous, but he himself, maybe he didn't think those crimes were heinous. You know, maybe he had his own reasons for that. Maybe he had some sort of predisposition to committing those crimes. Maybe he had some sort of neurological wiring. Maybe he had some conflicts of interest there. Maybe he was trying to make more money to get by. You know, who knows the reasons of why he committed these crimes. Of course, I don't condone that. And, you know, it's very, you know, they're very bad crimes. But of course, acceptance doesn't mean agreement, all right? And that's very much the way out of Harm OCD, right? It's very much, you know, acceptance doesn't mean agreement. It's coming to terms with the fact that as human beings, we may act in those heinous and quote unquote bad ways. There may be sort of influences that lead us up to acting in those ways, and over time it's gradually moving towards that angle of acceptance and really coming to terms with that on a deeper level. And that's when Harm OCD really does start to lose its grip. So yeah, just at the first location, like I said, you can imagine how different it would have been during the Victorian area of London. Very dark, very dingy. But yeah, if you do have Harm OCD, it's very important that you start exposing yourself to these and gradually chipping away at those irrational beliefs and those conditional self-acceptance sort of frameworks that allow OCD to flourish. All right, so let's get on to the second location. Hi everyone, it's Elliott here. Hope you're doing well. I'm just in between 2 locations of where Jack the Ripper committed 2 of his murders way back in 1888. And just as a reminder for those of you that don't know, Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who went around Victorian London and targeted women. And he's accredited with committing at least 5 murders. There may be 2 or 3 more, but sources can't confirm whether they were actually him or not. Because of the time, at the time there was no surveillance, police monitoring was very poor, and due to the, you know, the mysterious and gloomy dark nature of London at that time, you know, very dimly lit streets, crooked alleyways, narrow alleyways, not a lot of light. There were lots of crimes that were going on and people were getting away with lots of different things, and Jack the Ripper was no exception. He committed, like I said, at least 5 heinous murders. And yeah, if you're wondering why I'm speaking about this, you're probably thinking, what's this got to do with OCD? Well, of course it ties into Harm OCD, and I just wanted to speak a little bit about Harm OCD, right? So with Harm OCD, I had a bit of Harm OCD. It wasn't as latched for me as other themes such as, you know, the sexual orientation, fears, magic thinking, but I had an element of Harm OCD. And a lot of Harm OCD will come down to the moral aspect, right? It's that moral code that we hold ourselves to very rigidly. We hold ourselves hostage to that moral high code that we think we have to meet. And when we don't act in accordance with that, we can experience lots of guilt and shame. You know, you're a bad person. and we rate ourselves in our entirety of that. You can say that if you commit a bad act, you say that you're completely bad, and then it overlooks all the other acts that you may have done in your life. But of course, good and bad person, as Albert Ellis outlines, it's very hard to definitively say that you're entirely good or bad, because it only implies that you can have one or the other, and that you can't have a mixture of both, and it also assumes that all of your future actions will be bad, right? So harm OCD is a very of course it's a very difficult thing to deal with, as they all are very taboo, because it feels like you're never going to be able to accept it. It feels like there's that neverness. How could I possibly accept doing an act that's so bad? How could I really live with that, right? And with harm OCD, you have to come from that angle of acceptance, in a way compassion. It's seeing that as a human being there are certain reasons why we may act in certain ways, and that doesn't mean we like for that to happen. That doesn't mean we want for that to happen. Acceptance doesn't mean agreement, and it's not an excuse to do bad acts. No, doing bad acts, I don't condone that. Many other people don't condone that. Society doesn't condone that. If you commit a bad act, then you're going to face the punishment of that, absolutely. But there are many reasons as to why people do these things, and it's not in black and white to say, yep, you're bad, right? There could be some sort of predisposition in there. There could be a cultural factor, a genetic factor, a biological factor in there that's led you up to that moment. In a moment of anger, maybe that person has switched, right? Human beings are very capable of just switching in the moment. When that anger really stirs up, something switches in the brain. That impulse that can be dictated there can lead to a human acting in a bad way in the moment. And the examples of that are everywhere. You see in the crime every day, people get murdered, people get physically beaten. There is that element in there in the human brain where people can act in that way. And again, acceptance doesn't mean agreement, but it's just really coming to terms with that, right? So you've got the guilt and shame element there. You've got the bad person. You've got the fear of going to jail. What if I go to jail and my life's ruined? What if I lose all my friends and family? How can I possibly live with myself? Sometimes with harm OCD as well, it's going to feel like you want to go and hand yourself into the police because you feel like you're going to get that relief, but that never brings relief, right? It comes down to the unconditional self-acceptance again, right? Again, I had to break that down. Go to jail. Even if I went to jail, how would I possibly deal with that? How could I come to terms with that? How could I adjust to that? What good things could come from that, even if I did go to jail? And there's going to be a lot of that with harm OCD. It's almost like one of those things where you think there's no positive outcome that could come from it. And the cons of committing a bad act like murder is a way going to outweigh the pros, right? You're going to probably go to jail. You're probably going to miss out on life. There might be that element of self-hatred that comes from that. There's going to be all of those different things that happen. However, I know it's going to sound like we're scraping the bottom of the barrel, but hear me out on this one. Even if we did commit such an act and we reformed in the future and we learned from that act, then surely that's something positive that could come from that, right? That's something that you can cling on to with harm OCD, and it does take a while to see that even if you have acted in this way, there's no reason why you shouldn't act in that way. And how could I possibly turn that into a benefit? You look at people that have been to prison, you look at people that have reformed, they've gone on to make a change in their life and maybe help other people and to live more efficiently and productively going forward, having learned that lesson. Again, I don't condone that, but we've got to see what we can take from that, even if it was to be true, right? So there's all of that going on. And you're going to have loads of avoidance and compulsions around fear of harm, causing harm. So it might be hiding knives in the kitchen. It might be refusing to be in the house by yourself with your partner or loved one or family because you think, oh, what if I lose control and commit a crime? You might have a fear of committing a crime whilst at night, so you might really tightly wrap yourself in your blanket so you don't do something in the night. You might refuse to go near like a person or a family member whilst being on a set of stairs in case you push them. It can not just be harm as well, it can also be like pushing people, driving as well. It can tie into that and that responsibility element, but mainly it's those visceral, those vivid images of you causing harm with a knife in the kitchen. So yeah, you might not ever make dinner, you might hide the knives like I said, and just generally avoiding your family because you think you're a threat. You might be staying in your room a lot and just not being around them because it feels so real. It's going to feel like that essence of you wants that to happen. It's going to feel like you've got this devil in you, this sort of this sort of side to you, this dark side that just wants to act out and act on that urge in the moment till you cause harm. And it's really going to feel like that, and it's going to feel like amplified in those moments when you're angry, maybe you're feeling triggered, maybe you're feeling tired. Those sensations or urges of wanting to cause harm is going to feel arguably a lot more stronger than if you feel good, right? So you have to be aware of that, and it's so important that you wear all of those urges as best as you can. You know, try not to go down the route of, you know, avoiding the knives in the kitchen or avoiding being around other people, and all that sort of stuff. You really need to try and go towards that, you know, watching the documentaries. I remember watching In the Mind of Aaron Hernandez, which was about a guy who got repeated head trauma, and then he ended up causing harm to another American football player. And it really showed you that scientific element of how when the human brain can be really affected, how it can lead us to act erratically. And again, it's not an excuse, I'm not excusing that action, but it shows you that there's that neurological standpoint as well. Another book as well to really help with that is The Anatomy of Evil, and it goes into greater detail about why people commit crimes and do things the way that they do. And again, it's not as black and white to say, oh, you're a bad person, you're a monster. No, there's actually lots of different things that lead them up to that. And I think as you move towards acceptance of other people who may have committed certain acts and crimes, that will also help you to gradually accept yourself, because you don't tend to have unconditional other acceptance and self-acceptance with one or the other. You know, they tend to come hand in hand. All right, so yeah, you need to think about what you're really scared of here in terms of causing harm. You know, fear of guilt and shame, fear of being a bad person, fear of going to prison, you know, the responsibility element, that fear of fear angle, you know, never being able to move past that if it did happen. But you've got to remember as well, like, no human being is exempt from causing harm, you know, OCD or not, when we don't have that exception. Otherwise it would be completely impossible for us to do it. You know, people do commit harm to other people every day, right? Even, you know, intentionally, unintentionally. You look at somebody like Elliott, who was the actor, and he accidentally shot somebody on a movie set, and you could say that he's caused like the most heinous act there because he shot someone and they've died. But you know, the gun was loaded in his hand inadvertently, and he's acted in that way because he's a fallible human, and there was lots of other variables at stake there. So again, you've got to try and come at it from that angle of compassion. And I know it feels so hard. Those intrusive thoughts and sensations and urges are going to feel so vivid, they're going to feel so real, it's going to feel like absolutely terrifying that that's what you want. And that guilt and shame element is just going to be pounding away 24/7. You know, if only they knew as well, how can I live with myself? If only other people knew these thoughts that I was having about them, you know, they'd disown me, they'd ostracize me. You know, from a religious aspect as well, if only God knew that I was having these terrible thoughts, then I'd go to hell. And then you have to get comfortable with the uncertainty of that as well. So there's going to be like so many ways in which that can manifest. You know, fear of causing sexual harm as well, even with the POCD as well. Generally speaking, it is going to be the same thing though, right? You know, fear of being a bad person, fear of going to jail, fear of missing out on life. So yeah, it comes back down to the irrational beliefs as well, the shoulds, oughts and musts, and the awfulizing. You know, why shouldn't I be responsible for X, Y, Z? You know, would it really be awful if I was responsible for X, Y, Z? And you know, with that, again, it sounds like you're scraping the bottom of the barrel, and yeah, it would be pretty bad. But if there's something if something good could come from it, aka you learning from that experience and progressing and becoming more well-rounded going forward, then there could be a benefit that came from that, right? So again, it's about seeing all those different angles from whatever you're scared of. You know, dropping the safety behaviours, dropping the compulsions, dropping the avoidance behaviours, you know, not going down the route of reassurance, and yeah, just really trying to get comfortable feeling uncomfortable, and you know, wearing that rumination as well. It's going to feel very shocking as well in the initial moments with Harm OCD. Those thoughts are going to feel so taboo, and you know, it's going to feel like it's going against your morals or values. And you know, is this who I am? And you think like, oh, this whole act is you, and your mind is really going to lock onto that and constantly be thinking about that because of how taboo and how scary it feels, right? So again, you're going to have to wear that and really sort of try and go about your day as best as you can, allowing that rumination to play out. You know, where possible, try not to go down the route of problem solving it. Of course, a lot of that is going to be automatic, but you're going to have to really get comfortable with that in your mind, getting comfortable with the different urges that come up, and like I said, working towards unconditional self and life acceptance and breaking down the irrational beliefs that are fueling that. Hello everyone, it's Elliott here. I hope you're doing well. I'm just out about in London today, and I'm in Whitechapel, and I'm actually just at the second location of where Jack the Ripper committed his second murder, and that was of Annie Chapman way back in 1888 in Victorian London. And you know, Victorian London would have looked a lot different than it did today. It's a lot more up and coming, it's a lot more quirky, obviously it's a lot more built up. Victorian London back then, it would have been a very dark and desolate place. It would have been very mysterious. There would have been lots of you know, gang and crime going on just as people looked to make their way. It was a very sort of poor area of London at the time, and making ends meet was very, very difficult. And you know, crime and harm was very much the default for many people, right? There was lots of crime, like I said, there was lots of crime, there was lots of there was gang warfare around London at this time, the Chapel Street gang, excuse music in the background there. But yeah, crime was very much the default for people as they looked to really make a living and looked to get by. And that in their eyes meant overthrowing and undercutting other people, then so be it. And lots of people were resigned to that. They had really no other option to resort to crime. And you know, Jack the Ripper, nobody really knows why he did commit those crimes, very heinous acts, of course. But, you know, who knows? Maybe he has some kind of predisposition to committing those crimes. And there were like reasons for him acting in the ways that he did. Again, there were it's a big change for London at the time. There was a big influx of Jewish immigrants, Irish immigrants, living with the local population as well. And there definitely would have been some tensions at the times there, some religious tensions as people looked to adjust and adapt to this new way of life and to deal with these new sorts of people. And yeah, Jack the Ripper, obviously he made the most of the times, right? It's a very mysterious and murky and dark time for London. You know, lots of crooked alleys, lots of narrow back streets there, and yeah, he really used that to his favour to do what he did. And again, he probably had his reasons for doing those things that he did at the time. Again, not saying that I agree with that. No, he committed some very heinous acts. But with Harm OCD, it's so important that we come from that angle of understanding and acceptance, not only of other people, but also of ourselves too. And those two things do tend to come hand in hand. So yeah, I just thought it'd be really interesting to come out today and really show you what London's like now and how life would have been back then. You know, like I said, it would have been a very different way of life to what it is now. People were really just trying to make their own way. There was lots of, like I said, lots of crime, lots of poverty, prostitution, and yeah, people did resort to harm in order just to get by, and that was just the reality of living back then. And like I said, many people took advantage of that in different ways. So again, you know, we can see why people may act in the way that they do. We can come from that angle of acceptance, and you know, that really helps to deal with the Harm OCD. You know, how could I accept myself? How could I live with myself? How could I live with that guilt and shame if these things were true? So again, it's just really helps to paint the picture there about how we can move towards acceptance of other people and also ourselves.